Good afternoon, and on behalf of the research team here at Queen's University, myself, Siobhan McAllister, Mary Louise Core and Claire Dwyer, I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of this research report examining the transgenerational legacies of the conflict on children and young people in Northern Ireland and the border regions of Ireland. The research was commissioned by the Commission for Victims and Survivors and funded by SEUPB Peace 4. We're absolutely delighted that so many people are able to join us today from across Ireland and beyond, and representing such a diversity of sectors. This really is a testament to the commitment that we have to children and young people and to an understanding that conflict legacy is an issue of shared responsibility. We know that others are unable to join us today, so this event is being recorded and it will be hosted on the Centre for Children's Rights website. We also have the chat function open, and we encourage you to leave comments and share reflections with your fellow attendees. Over 2 decades after the signing of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, this research engaged with multiple generations in areas across Northern Ireland and the border regions of Ireland, which were most adversely affected by the conflict, in order to take stock, to consider what has changed for the generation born after ceasefires and agreements, what remains, and how the legacies of the past continue to impact children, young people, families, and communities. The research is a reminder that while much has been achieved, the pains of the past are still very present. Divisions remain, and there's a potential threat for many of violence within their communities. Today, the research team at Queen's, with the support of some of our Young People's Advisory Group, will present some of the key findings from the research and some recommendations. The full report and a summary report are now available to download from the Centre for Children's Rights website, and we're delighted that members of the advisory group have been working on designing a Young People's report, which will launch separately in December. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the members of the Young People's Advisory Group who, on and off and over very difficult circumstances, have been involved in the project for the past 2 to 3 years. We'd also like to thank youth initiatives, Include Youth and Lifford and Clonley Resource Centre for facilitating and supporting the involvement of young people. This research is all the stronger because of the direct involvement of young people in its design and interpretation. We'd also like to thank the adult advisory groups, which were facilitated by the Commission for Victims and Survivors, and of course to acknowledge the 195 individuals who took part in this research. Many shared personal and painful experiences and spoke with honesty and very openly about their hopes and fears for this generation and future generations. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Kula Yusuma, the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People, and by Andrew Sloan, the Chief Executive for the Commission for Victims and Survivors, who'll each reflect a little on the findings. I'll pass over now to Andrew, who's going to say a little about the background to the study and to outline the Commission's next steps.
Good afternoon. I would like to start by expressing my sincere thanks to Siobhan, Claire, Mary Louise and their colleagues at Queen's for hosting today's event. On behalf of the Commission for Victims and Survivors, I want to extend a very warm welcome to everybody who's taken the time to join us for the launch of the Peace 4 research project. It didn't end in 1998, examining the impacts of conflict legacy across the generations. I would also like to add my welcome and thanks to the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People for her attendance today and for her thoughts and reflections on the report, which we'll hear later. The Commission for Victims and Survivors have very much appreciated the contribution of our colleagues at the Northern Ireland Commission for Children and Young People in supporting the delivery of this important research study. Most importantly, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the over 100 children and young people, including those who participated in the Young People's Advisory Group. And it is great to know that some of them have joined us today, as well as the parents, youth practitioners, community workers, and other stakeholders who engaged with the research team. Your active commitment to this study during the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic has supported the research team in producing a comprehensive report that will inform important work in this area in the months and years ahead. It is regrettable that we have been unable to launch this important research report at an in-person event. However, the fact that over 100 people have registered for today's launch reflects the significant interest across a range of sectors in the focus of the study, its findings and recommendations. The research report is one of 4 studies funded by the Peace4 programme, focused on improving the health and well-being of victims and survivors, and those who continue to be negatively affected by the legacy of the Troubles. It very much builds on previous transgenerational research projects undertaken by the Commission in 2012 and 2015. This particular project was to follow up on a recommendation from the 2015 work through the adoption of a 2-generation approach, which would explore the impacts of conflict legacy issues on the current generation of our young people and on their relationship with parents and the older generations. It also responds to the needs over 2 decades after the Good Friday Belfast Agreement to grasp a contemporary understanding of how young people's lives can be affected by ongoing sectarianism, segregation, and the persistent threat of paramilitarism. The title of the report, It Didn't End in 1998, certainly reaffirms how the legacy of the Trouble continues to directly and indirectly affect the health and well-being of our children and young people. Across the report's 6 thematic areas, the study provides an important and timely insight into how conflict legacy issues continue to create a series of negative impacts on young people and their families across the generations in different ways. I will let the research team cover the details of these impacts in their presentation. The Commission will continue to work with partners across different sectors and government departments to highlight the report's key findings and recommendations in the months ahead. The wide-ranging analysis across the different areas will provide an important source of data to inform the ongoing development of a new strategy for victims and survivors. Critical to this work is the importance of adopting a more holistic and cross-departmental approach to building a better future for victims and survivors and wider society. We often hear about joined-up approaches to working, but often it can be difficult to determine what that actually looks like in practice. As budgets tighten in the aftermath of the pandemic, working smarter across government has never been more crucial. The issues drawn out in this research, for example, shared spaces, education, and family life, are not siloed to any one age group. They permeate across society. What we need are ways to open conversations and bring voices of victims and survivors to areas they have not historically been sought. Equally, and what this important piece of work from the team at Queen's highlights, is the need to include and engage children and young people in conversations and decisions that affect their todays and tomorrows. We cannot ignore the far-reaching effects of the conflict on everyday life, whether it be education, health, justice, or communities. For our part, we recently drew on the themes explored in this research and a recent public opinion survey and advocated strongly at the Executive Office Committee for departmental champions on victims' issues to be established across all departments. Similarly, we have reached out to local authorities to discuss how we can do the same across local government and community planning to ensure that upholding children's rights remains a focal point. It is important that learning from the past is considered in all areas of government policymaking, and we continue to make real and better future we promised our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
The signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998 brought to an end 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland. However, now over 2 decades since the signing of the agreement and the introduction of peace, the conflict continues to have a lasting impact on economic, social, and cultural life. Research has evidenced how the legacies of the conflict have been experienced across generations and have highlighted how legacy of the conflict continues to affect the lives of children and young people. This transgenerational legacy extends beyond the psychological trauma and can include socioeconomic and structural transgenerational legacies, in that children growing up in some communities are negatively affected by residual sectarianism, continued segregation, and chronic underinvestment in their communities. As a result of the continued impacts of the conflict, many children and young people have had their rights infringed or compromised, including but not limited to the protection from violence, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, belief, and religion, the freedom of association, adequate healthcare, and the right to adequate standard of living, and the right to leisure, play, and culture, all of which have been identified and reiterated by the Commissioner for Children's Rights and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. The legacy of the conflict should therefore be understood as a significant children's rights issue. In addressing conflict legacy issues, it's important that children and young people have a role and participate in conflict transformation, peace building, and policy development. Research has highlighted that failing to include participation and experiences of children and young people in transitional justice processes not only neglects Article 12 of the UNCRC, but can also have a significant impact on the long-term transition to peace. This study, using a children's rights lens, focuses on the continuing transgenerational impacts of the Troubles on the lives of children and young people and parents throughout Northern Ireland and the border region of Ireland. The project adopted a two-generational approach, exploring and identifying the experiences and needs of current generations of children and young people affected by conflict legacy and their relationships with older generations, many of whom experienced the worst years of the conflict. This study collected the views and experiences of 195 individuals across 7 research sites. This included key stakeholders, community workers, youth workers, parents, and 104 children and young people aged 14 to 24. A number of the research themes were identified and agreed upon in consultation with the Victims Commission's Research Advisory Committee, the Transgenerational Research Advisory Group, and with youth advisory groups. Engagement with the young people's advisory groups was key and fundamental to the implementation of the research approach. As the project was grounded in child's rights-based approach, the participation of young people was embedded throughout all stages of the project. There were 2 groups of young people involved in the project as research advisors. They were from Derry Londonderry and Donegal, and they were all involved in the STRIVE programme. At the start of the project, members of the research team met with the young people and discussed the background of the project, what it was all about, and carried out workshops on the meaning of children's rights and conflict legacy. The young people worked with the team to plan and develop the types of questions to ask young people and ways to talk about issues such as mental health and violence. Some came up with different ideas on how to collect information. A number of the advisory group got the opportunity to visit Queen's and to meet the former Victims Commissioner as well. At this time as well, they had the opportunity to talk to some of the research findings. The groups have continued to work with the research team during the recent COVID lockdowns, and meetings were held online. A number of young people who were unable to take part in the online activities rejoined the group when we moved back to face-to-face. So some young advisors have been involved in our analysis of the research findings and did so both online and face-to-face. The groups also helped think about some of our recommendations based on what young people, community workers, and stakeholders told us. Now that we have been able to meet face-to-face again, a number of the group have been working with us to design a young people's version of the research findings, helping with definitions of words used in the report, choosing quotes, and also designing images to include in the report. So this slide then just shows some of the reflections that the young people expressed about working with the Young People's Advisory Group, with some highlighting how the experience helped them develop their own understanding of their rights. So there are 7 themes to the report. The first to explore how children and young people learn about the past and how they learn about culture and identity. The remaining 4 themes examine the various ways in which the legacies of the conflict continue to impact on young people, families and communities in relation to divided space, health and well-being, parenting, family life and relationships, and so-called paramilitarism and policing. We are mindful of debates regarding the validity of concepts such as paramilitaries and paramilitarism. However, these terms are included throughout the report as they are frequently used by the research participants when referencing ongoing violence and the threat of violence carried out by organised groups across the island of Ireland. The report concludes by outlining young people's hopes and concerns for the future and collating key messages young people have for government. Children's rights implications and recommendations for policy and practice are considered across the report themes. So we'll now move to draw out some of our key findings across the report, and we will start with Jessica to listen to her key findings on learning the past.
Learning from the past. In the research, young people were asked about what they knew about the Troubles, where they learned about the past and what they thought of the learning. Overall, young people knew quite a lot about the Troubles and were able to talk about the sensitive and challenging issues. They learned from a range of sources, but mostly from schools and families. Some young people said their families did not really talk to them about the past, while others heard detailed stories from the older generations. Children and young people had very different experiences from learning from the Troubles. This would depend on their school, subject choices, teachers' views, and abilities to talk to them about it. For some young people, learning in school was incomplete or didn't even happen at all. Young people were also concerned that many of the accounts this generation heard about from the past, from families in their communities or on social media, were one-sided. Some felt that these could glorify the past, while others felt that it didn't include both sides, could encourage sectarian views. While some young people felt that the learning about the past could be negative, others thought that it would be important to understand what happened, to think about how it impacts on the present, and to learn from the past. Young people recognised that this may not be easy, as there were very few safe spaces to openly speak about the past and express their different views. I think it's important that us as young people do learn about the Troubles. It's history. We should all know what happened in the past. We could ask our family members, friends, to tell us about it, and even Google. It's important that we all know the story behind it.
As Jessica has noted, the research suggests that there's a range of views on how young people learn about the past, with some noting very different experiences about learning about the conflict. Given the range of learning evident across the generations, as a result of passing stories through the community and family, learning should facilitate dialogue between the generations and build on young people's capacity to interrogate stories in a safe and diverse way. A two-generation approach to learning is required, either in school or in community settings, where discussions can be held in safe spaces, within and across the generations. Indeed, under Article 17 of the UNCRC, states are required to ensure that children have access to information and material from a diversity of cultural resources. Children and young people should have access to a range of accessible sources and information, for example, through an oral history archive, but should also be involved in the development of child-informed and child-friendly sources related to the conflict. The school curriculum should be revised to consider the delivery of teaching on the conflict, with consideration given to the age at which formal learning may start and that age-appropriate activities are developed. Parents, guardians, and young people need to be consulted on the revision of the curriculum to ensure that learning at home is considered in conjunction with school learning. It is important that children and young people are consulted in the development of learning resources and methods. It's crucial to ensure that they are relevant and appropriate to children's interests, and in line with Article 12, to ensure that young people's views are taken into account. Delivery of teaching on the conflict should be embedded in a subject where there is space for discussion and debate, taking into account the age at which to introduce learning to ensure that this begins before any negative attitudes can be entrenched. Training and support should be provided for teachers to develop and expand their capacity to teach on conflict and cross-community issues, taking into account the sensitivities and emotional needs of both students and teachers, particularly where they are dealing with their own related issues.
The research examined young people's views and understanding of identity and cultural expression and where this was learned. It explored the extent to which they adopted a particular identity, the ways in which identity and culture were expressed, and the related impact. Young people's elaboration on some of these themes or terms was limited at times, perhaps reflecting a struggle to articulate the meaning of identity and culture, as these terms often remain associated with the conflict. Although most young people in the study lived in communities historically identified along ethno-national identities, they differed in the extent to which they assumed these labels as individuals. Indeed, a few young people in focus group discussions claimed to identify strongly with particular identities or communities. Some drew a generational distinction. They felt that claiming an identity was more important for older individuals in the community. Young people and community representatives also noted a tendency to impose an identity on young people through assumptions made in wearing of a school uniform, participation in a cross-community group, or as a result of pressure to demonstrate affiliation to the community. They also suggested that a tendency to classify young people in terms of their religion or nationality denied them the choice to be defined by other characteristics they considered more important to their identity. Most accounts reflected on the visible expressions or symbols of identity that were present in young people's communities, and they noted that these tended to intensify at certain times of the year. Young people's association with such visual expressions did indicate some level of community membership. For some, symbols of identity could indicate a place of belonging, a sense of ownership, and safety. At the same time, symbols indicated to young people places where they don't belong and could therefore contribute to establishing a sense of difference between communities. When symbolic expressions were used to communicate sectarian views or support particular organizations, young people were more likely to raise questions regarding an element of hate. Participation in events such as parades and marches and attendance at bonfires remained for some an essential aspect of cultural identity and tradition. We spoke to a father and daughter from the same family who described a number of positive aspects. The father described the sense of community belonging associated with such events. His daughter acknowledged the potential to establish family connectedness across generations and an opportunity to honour deceased family members and family traditions. However, a number of young people also spoke of cultural events associated with the other community, and their views tended to be informed by events in the past. They described emotive aspects of events, which were often interpreted as exclusionary, antagonistic, and that precipitated fear. These also had potential to lead to disorder and violence. Similar to their accounts about learning from the past, as Jessica has already recounted for us, family was the key source of learning about identity and culture, as views and narratives were passed down through generations. The views and attitudes by parents, grandparents, and other family members were strongly embedded in past experiences of the conflict. And many participants referenced some concern about the transmission of these to the current generation of young people. There was the potential for young people to adopt and act upon such narratives, which could manifest in the way they voted, them identifying difference, feeling fear or hatred towards the other community, thus having the potential to foster sectarian beliefs. A number of participants also expressed concerns that such views could be entrenched at a young age prior to any formal learning about the past. The findings reinforce previous research, noting the potential for older generations to influence children's views, shape their beliefs and opinions, and instill negative attitudes. They importantly highlight that these issues persist a number of years on. However, the findings also reveal that this influence is not inevitable. Indeed, some young people demonstrated an ability to resist or challenge such views. This highlights the potential for changing attitudes across generations and perhaps is reflective of ongoing engagement with young people in the community, which focuses on challenging narratives of difference. Much of what young people knew about culture and identity was learnt through the family or community. However, states are obligated to direct education to the development of children's respect for human rights and their understanding of their own and other cultures in accordance with Article 29 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Concerns in the way young people's identity may be assumed or forced, the ways in which the passing of tradition may be threatened or questioned, and the transmission of sectarian or divisive views all raise concerns in relation to children's rights to freedom of expression and to freedom of thought, belief, and religion. The findings suggest that the transmission of negative views across generations can be broken, particularly when children and young people are provided the safe space to voice their views and have their opinions heard in line with their rights under Article 12. They need to be consulted on what these spaces should look like and how they can explore the meaning of their own culture and identity and to learn about those of others. These conversations need to include intergenerational dialogue on interpretations of identity and difference. Expressing culture and identity remains important to young people and their communities. We need to involve young people in the planning of community events which facilitate safe celebration of their culture and identity.
Health and well-being. Many of our parents grew up during the Troubles. The research found that some parents had experienced or saw violence or loss as children, and that this still impacts their health and well-being today. Some still feel fearful and worried about possible dangers and that their safety may be under threat. Pain and memories had sometimes been locked away and were only appearing and being talked about now. This was often because of Troubles-related news stories, TV programs, and historical investigations. Some parents saw their own parents deal with fear, violence, and pain through not talking about it or misusing prescription drugs or alcohol to numb the pain. Some parents had learned these as ways of coping. Young people in the research spoke a lot about poor mental health among young people in their communities. They often linked this to a lack of opportunities or drug or alcohol misuse. Many said there were not enough mental health services, especially for children and young people. More mental health services are needed because people's health is still impacted by what went on in the past. Young people are growing up in families and communities that are still affected by violence and past trauma. Currently, there are huge barriers which could be broken down presented to people in order to access mental health services. There's a lack of mental health services, which in turn creates lengthy waiting lists for people to access services and resources. This barrier could be broken down easily with the allocation of more mental health services. It is highlighted through this research that many people are suffering with mental health issues due to past events, which in turn is causing health and well-being of individuals to deteriorate. People in rural areas are particularly affected by barriers disabling them from accessing the services they need. It is sometimes forgotten about the existence of these rural border communities and how they have also suffered from the Troubles. Currently, people living in these rural border communities have to travel to access services, and many do not have access to public transport, also due to the rural location. If more mental health services are allocated, there's a possibility of locating services near these rural regions or more transport services to access services. It is vital more services are implemented to allow people to receive help and support their journey to recovery and the ability to thrive. The research highlighted that people didn't talk about events that occurred and that many bottle up their traumatic memories and events, which in turn is causing worryingly low levels of health and well-being among the population. I have created this drawing to represent a quote said by an individual during research to put the quote into perspective in a visual manner. It is important that people receive the help and support and resources to talk. Otherwise, as said before, people bottle up their thoughts. Sticking to the reference of a bottle, given an individual is represented by the bottle will eventually become worn and cracked with the pressure of thoughts being enclosed and will become damaged permanently and will be unable to reach their full potential from this damage, trauma, and strain.
As Katie has demonstrated, the research suggests that the outworkings and manifestations of conflict-related harm can be delayed and emerge sometimes unexpected at critical junctions in people's lives. As such, it may take considerable time before individuals require or seek help and support. There is therefore a need for long-term funding of victim services. However, not all who experience conflict-related harms define themselves as victims or recognize that some of the difficulties they experience can be traced back to conflict-related experiences. They may therefore not access victim services. As such, safe places are required to discuss and share conflict-related experiences. Community-based programs should be funded and developed in consultation with communities. Community workers should be trained and supported in delivering programs exploring the conflict and its impacts. While many of the stories shared in this research were those of individuals and families, the conflict's lasting impact on deprivation, opportunities and investment, under-resourcing of communities and essential services was widely discussed. Evidently, there is a need to develop psychological, social, political, and economic responses to address the social causes of health issues related to the conflict. Mental health responses in isolation will not attend to the impacts of conflict legacy on the health and well-being of the current and future generations of young people. That said, the resourcing of mental health services, particularly for children and young people, is paramount. Child and adolescent and drug and alcohol mental health services are not responding to the needs of children and young people, compromising their rights to effective healthcare under Article 24 of the UNCRC, and for some, survival and development. These issues make it difficult to respond to children and young people's mental health issues. Poor mental health, combined with lack of access to effective services, can enhance vulnerability to problematic drug and substance misuse. As a consequence, when the right to effective healthcare is compromised, so too can Article 33 of the UNCRC, the right to protection from illicit substances. This was identified as a major area of concern among children and young people in this research, and by some adults as a transgenerational coping mechanism in the face of restricted services. Responses therefore need to be both coordinated and integrated.
As noted, the research took a generational approach, and in the context of family life, this meant that we asked parents to reflect on how they were parented and to consider how conflict-related experiences may have impacted their family lives as children and young people. Some then went on to consider how these experiences, layered with additional personal experiences, impacted themselves and potentially the parenting of their own children. Young people also reflected on family life and considered how conflict legacy may impact parenting today. This generational approach to the research, therefore, revealed that attitudes, concerns, fears, and behaviours could be transmitted not just across generations, but also within families. Overall, the research adds to a body of evidence identifying silence as a means of coping and a strategy employed by parents to avoid passing traumatic experiences to children, but also as something that could inadvertently be detrimental and potentially be generative. The cross-generational approach applied to the research also demonstrates that strongly linked to silence within families is sensing, as members of both the parent generation and the current generation, as they reflected on family life, talked about sensing something being wrong despite silence and avoidance of talking about the issue. Silence and sensing had led to confusion, half-truths, heightened anxiety, and feelings of insecurity among children. Silence, therefore, acted in opposition to its intent, which was to protect and stabilise. Indeed, a small number of the young people that we spoke with, while sensing that there was something going on with a parent and noting how it impacted on their own well-being, also tried to hide this as a means to protect their parent from further hurt. Silence, therefore, as we see, can be reproductive. Silence can reproduce silence, with some parents identifying that it had filtered into their own parenting and some young people noting that their generation were reticent to talk. Parents and young people also reflected on other ways in which the impacts and legacies of the conflict filtered through families. Some parents, for example, spoke of how experiencing overprotective parenting themselves as children had caused them to be anxious as parents themselves. And while this emanated from a place of care, this could reproduce mistrust of the other community and fear and insecurity among young people. There was often a difficult recognition for some parents, therefore, that in their efforts to protect and care for children, that this nature of parenting had impacted on children's well-being and their freedoms and opportunities. Other representatives in the research spoke of patterns of substance use in families as an intergenerational coping mechanism. As Katie very clearly outlined, the research suggests that the impacts of the conflict have been delayed and are only now emerging for some. For others, historical inquiries resurface pain. And this means that young people today may actually be faced with parental grief, anger, and hurt for the first time, or in particularly acute ways at particular times. And the impact of this on the ability to parent effectively and therefore on children's well-being was discussed by many research participants. Indeed, accounts suggest that some young people today presenting to mental health services are experiencing poor mental health that might at least in part be attributed to their parents' conflict-related experiences. And this, of course, may be the case for others, but the connection has yet to be traced. As a representative from the health sector explained, actually disentangling the impacts of conflict legacy from other stressors is difficult, and this can present in a range of ways. However, when examining the histories of some of the young people who presented to their services, it was evidence that there was conflict-related trauma within their families. The UNCRC clearly states that the family is key to the growth and well-being of children, and that for harmonious development, children should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. It also states that the family, and therefore parents, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance, resources, and supports to enable this. Supporting parents and families experiencing the legacy of the conflict, therefore, is key to supporting children's development and well-being and to the realisation of children's rights. And while supporting parents to meet their responsibilities to children is of course important, so too are children's own rights to access healthcare services. As the research demonstrated, the mental health of some children is negatively impacted as a consequence of their parents' conflict-related experiences. And as Katie very clearly outlined, there are still significant barriers and delays to accessing appropriate child and adolescent mental health services within Northern Ireland and the border regions of Ireland. So in addition to the recommendations related to health, the research findings point to the need for sustained funding for transgenerational services, giving increased evidence of the transgenerational impacts of trauma and conflict legacy. Also, some of the issues identified in the research, such as breaking cycles of silence, identifying and responding to transgenerational coping mechanisms within families, could also be explored in existing and future programmes within communities. For example, peace-funded youth programmes and those programmes under the auspices of the Tackling Paramilitarism initiative. Importantly, though, this research very clearly revealed that there are few opportunities for parents to discuss their experiences of growing up during the conflict and to reflect in safe spaces how this may impact their family lives today and their relationships and their parenting. Greater funding of parenting programmes, therefore, in communities that were most adversely affected by the conflict is needed, because supporting parents has the potential to support children and young people.
Research sites were selected as communities which had been disproportionately impacted by the conflict. Therefore, it may have been expected that young people and community representatives in Northern Ireland would describe highly segregated communities in relation to residential segregation, segregated education, and engagement in single identity activities. Each of these were found to limit the potential to interact with young people who associate with other backgrounds. For some young people and adults in Northern Ireland, segregation in the community can offer a sense of safety, often linked to the impact of hearing about family members' experiences of the past. As a result, some participants, both young and older, reflected concerns about attempts to increase integration and the potential for violence if peace walls came down. The impacts of segregation, however, were felt across a number of areas of young people's lives. Young people's experiences and willingness to move within and outside of their communities varied. Some described developing a knowledge of safe or unsafe areas from family and friends who warned of staying away from the other community. This meant that some young people were unwilling to venture too far. They described restrictions on their movements, feeling unable to access play or leisure facilities in certain areas, or feeling unsafe as they met peers in public spaces. They noted the threat of violence as an inhibitor to entering other communities. Their accounts therefore highlight some continuity in experiences across generations. But young people also described some mobility as they spoke of socialising in other communities or with young people from a different background. Increased interaction was facilitated by developing independence in later teenage years and extending their social lives geographically or into an online context, which can help circumvent physical barriers in the community. However, while able to navigate different communities, young people also placed restrictions on themselves to manage their safety. They took account of how they dressed, what they said, and who they were seen with. Their movement, therefore, was not entirely free nor without reservation. The majority of young people in research sites in Northern Ireland were or had been in segregated education. Young people in the border region of Ireland did not describe their schooling as segregated. Nevertheless, discussions illustrated that many of their schools were identified along religious lines. Most participants noted the limitations of a segregated system, that young people did not learn about other religions, that it creates and reinforces barriers between young people of different communities, and that it can foster a sense of difference and sectarian attitudes. Those who had experiences of shared education programs noted that unfamiliarity between young people could prove problematic and that challenges existed where views and feelings of difference may already be entrenched. Amongst adult participants, particularly community representatives and key stakeholders, segregated education was viewed as one of a number of mechanisms in the community, along with residential segregation, which created and reinforced barriers between young people of different communities. Young people noted that participation in cross-community programs had potential to create safe, shared spaces which encouraged discussion and where they could hear neutral accounts, challenge narratives, and have their voice heard. They also acknowledged the similarities as opposed to differences between themselves and other young people. Whilst not all young people remain in contact after engagement with cross-community programs, some did describe the potential for more lasting friendships and the role that social media could play in facilitating this. Both the accounts of young people and youth workers, however, suggest that such work faces challenges, with short-term funding cycles, attitudes of parents and grandparents inhibiting young people's participation, and requirements to recruit young people across religious lines. There were also limitations to the potential of such programs within a wider context of division and segregation, and where young people were reminded of the dangers of integration at particular points in the year. But in their messages to decision makers, many young people called for increased shared spaces, including youth groups, where they could get to know young people from different backgrounds. The findings therefore indicate the continued impact of persistent segregation in the lives of children and young people, despite the implementation of a number of strategies aimed to facilitate a more united and shared society. perceived restrictions on their movements, the impact of segregation on leisure environments and barriers to accessing or participating in cross-community projects, all raise implications for their rights under Articles 13 and 31 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The analysis highlights a need for further and longer term investment of cross-community programmes to provide a safe space for interaction. The findings also speak strongly to maintaining cross-community and good relations at the forefront of youth programmes. Increasing the provision of integrated education is also supported by the study's findings, and attention should be given to the Committee on the Rights of the Child's concluding observations in 2016 that a fully integrated education system is actively promoted. Finally, the analysis identifies an increased need for shared spaces for young people to come together safely without being subject to negative attitudes and develop greater understanding of each other and to foster the development of lasting friendships and networks.
While this research demonstrates that many are still impacted by the legacies of violence, it also points to conflict-related violence as a feature of many communities today. Some families dealing with the pains of past violence experienced during the conflict are also dealing with present-day fear, intimidation, and violence within their communities. Over 20 years after the ceasefires and peace agreements, this research demonstrates that the intimidation, abuse, and exploitation of children by so-called paramilitary groups is commonplace within some communities. Detailed accounts of harm demonstrate the range of ways in which children, young people, and parents continue to experience coercive control. Yet abuses on individuals rarely have isolated effects. Whole families and communities are impacted. And a number of community representatives spoke of an almost paralysis of dealing with the issue. Indeed, some noted a lack of support from the police, social services and health, and of having to put themselves in vulnerable situations to protect and support young people. While young people themselves spoke of the impact of the presence of these groups on their mental health, more often they spoke of an undercurrent of paranoia or an air of unease, and simply of adopting strategies to avoid the possibility of physical or psychological harm. Normalising violence or the potential for it was prevalent and appeared to enable young people to get on and get by in the context of their everyday lives. Normalisation, avoidance, and minimising the impacts of their experiences, therefore, were ways of coping with and managing violence. And these are some of the very techniques that their parents spoke about as ways of coping during the conflict. This may suggest, therefore, that these are coping strategies that are passed down generationally. However, that violence and the presence of groups that coerce and control communities is normalised by no means that it is accepted. Many in the research likened these groups to criminal gangs, spoke of their damaging effects on their communities, and employed the language of child abuse, exploitation, and grooming in describing how they preyed on children and manipulated young people. Participants identified a range of ways in which children and young people were exploited. Some accounts illustrated, for example, the power or the pull of local histories and family networks in young people's involvements in these groups, and indeed the difficulty of breaking some of these pathways. Others spoke of the active politicisation, provocation, and agitation of young people at particular times of year, and of the exploitation of fears, uncertainties, and tensions which were used to pull young people into violence. Indeed, the examples provided here are a reminder of the power and the pull of the past, as the issues used to incite violence among children and young people typically related to disputes over identity, territory, and legacy issues. But by far the most commonly raised issue in relation to young people being vulnerable to exploitation by these groups was their marginalisation and lack of opportunities. The draws for young people were not only financial, but linked to a search for status, respect, and power, and for some, a means of escape or a response to what some community representatives described as a sense of hopelessness among young people in their community. Additionally, particularly vulnerable children and young people were described as being befriended or approached to do wee jobs. And many understood this to be part of a larger grooming process that led children to become more deeply involved in drug taking, crime, or violence. Despite a deep understanding of the impact of these groups and their impacts on children, young people, and communities, the research demonstrates the difficulties in responding to this issue. The communities most affected today are those that will experience the regulation, control, and perceived protection from paramilitaries in the past. There are communities which experienced negative interactions with the police and communities which experienced a lack of investment and resourcing. And many of these issues remain. Despite recent initiatives on what some people in the research described as a presence of services, there was a sense that the burden fell on those within communities to respond, particularly at crisis points. So these experiences, alongside a sense that the policing of these groups was ineffectual, had served to perpetuate a belief among many that nothing could be done to respond to this issue. States have a duty to protect children from all forms of physical and mental violence, injury or abuse, maltreatment or exploitation. Yet, since the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, consistent concerns have been raised about violence by non-state actors and the exploitation and abuse of children. We recommend, therefore, that the state uphold their duty to action the recommendations of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and the UN Committee Against Torture, which state that they should take immediate and effective measures to protect children from violence by non-state actors, including recruitment into violent activities, and to strengthen efforts to promptly and effectively investigate cases of paramilitary violence, ensuring that perpetrators are prosecuted and that victims have access to effective protection and can obtain redress. In relation to recovery and redress, we actually know very little about the psychological effects of this form of violence on children and young people, both immediately and in the long term. Children under threat, intimidation, and experiencing violence must have supports. And this research suggests that at present, while there may be some support provided within communities, there appear to be few specialist services for communities to refer children on to. Further to this, while there are clearly positive moves to redefine some of the activities discussed here as criminality, the historical and political disputes that feed into them should not be ignored. It is these that destabilise peace and energise support for these groups at particular times. Addressing this particular issue, therefore, requires addressing wider legacy issues. Finally, little is known about how young women experience the violence related to conflict legacy. And while this research points to some of the experiences of young women, there's a need for specific research into how young women experience this type of violence, as well as more explicit and visible actions relating to young women in peace building and tackling paramilitarism initiatives.
Giving voice to future hopes. Children and young people involved in the research were asked about their hopes and fears for the future. They were also invited to write a message to government. Some young people spoke negatively about the government and felt that they never take young people's opinions seriously. Many said that it was important for young people to be heard by government. Young people shared concerns about the lack of child and youth-focused services in their areas. A hope for the future was for government to fund more mental health services. Many also shared concerns about the lack of youth centres or youth groups in their areas and spoke of the impact of this on young people and their community. It was also important to many of the young people that government understand the difficulties they face around employment opportunities, the impact of poor transport, particularly in rural areas, climate change, and the impact of Brexit. Many young people expressed a hope to leave the violence of the past behind for a safer society with communities living together in peace. A clear message to government is the need for them to protect children and young people from the violent legacy of the Troubles and to build a more united and understanding society. It is important that governments listen to young people because young people today are now given the resources to become educated about decisions and their impacts and given the support for them to thrive and in turn present new intelligent initiatives. I feel if young people were given the chance to be heard, great views, ideas and ways to move forward would be presented. We as young people are the core of the future society and the people in which usually the decisions made impact the most. I'm now going to introduce Kula, the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Katie. Many of you will know who I am. I'm Kula Yasuma, and I am the Commissioner for Children and Young People. And I am often required to follow young people. So please don't think I'm going to be anywhere as good or as articulate as Katie was, because I haven't got a mission. So I am going to just reflect on this research, and probably I'd be surprised if I say anything that most of you haven't heard already today, but I don't actually think that's a bad thing. As I was listening to Andrew speaking earlier, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to say that, oh, I'm going to say that, but actually that's probably okay. So I hope you can bear with me. So I do remember the first time I told a young person that we were in a post-conflict society. And he invited me to visit his community, look around and tell him whether the conflict had ended. So it didn't end in 1998 for so many, and for some, the repercussions continue to be paralysing. When I became Commissioner for Children, I set priorities. It was mental health, poverty and inclusive education. One of the first things we did was ask young people their thoughts on these priorities. And generally they agreed, but also they independently raised the issue of paramilitary control of their communities and their lives and the legacy of the conflict. This was then added as a priority for my office and has been since 2015. And we were pleased when Judith Thompson, the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors, wanted to pursue the issue. And we worked together with her and her team to develop this piece of research. And you've already heard Andrew say how deeply and intimately involved we were with this piece of work. And we're very, very proud to have done so and to have acted as key advisors to CVSNI and to Queen's at every stage of the process and the partner pieces of research. I do recommend, I know you've heard a lot about the research today, but I really recommend you read it. It's long, but it's worth it. It is very long, ladies. I don't know what to say, but it is. But it's really worth it. And I wouldn't have envied you trying to cut it down anymore. This report makes for really sobering reading and outlines very clearly the work that's still to be done if, as a society, we are serious about giving our children the best start in life. I applaud the children's rights approach taken by the authors and commend them for their integration of the UNCRC and the UN Committee's recommendations in every aspect of the report. And you've seen that in today's presentation. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that this time next year, the committee will again be re-examining the UK government on its progress. So we've clearly seen, and we've talked a lot about paramilitarism, and we have clearly seen a change in the narrative concerning so-called paramilitary groups to one of criminal gangs, which more accurately describes these groups. And it is to be welcomed. But it remains deeply concerning that this and other reports continue to reiterate the way that these gangs control and traumatize their communities and children and young people in particular. The normalization of violence and the abuse of children, not only through physical assaults, but coercive control and sexual exploitation, is commonplace in too many communities. Another recent report, Beyond the Spark by Queen's academic Colin Walsh, clearly portrays children's fear in speaking out of this issue. Paul Smith talks about the societal shrug and then the related continued inability of the criminal justice system to properly address this issue is really distressing and unacceptable. Today's report lays out the consequences of this, which, and I quote, is that the burden to respond falls on individuals and services within the very communities most affected. Meanwhile, it's not perceived as a societal issue, but one of certain individuals in certain areas. In no other scenario, and certainly not up the road here from Queens in the Malone Road, would we ever tolerate this level of abuse of our children and young people. It is imperative that we ensure the full and effective protection of children and young people from trauma, from violence, mistreatment, and criminal coercion in their communities. Many of you will be aware that my office issued advice regarding the criminal coercion of children, and we've seen some of the behaviour repeated this week on our streets, and the child-centred approach that is required as a response to it. And my office will continue to work with relevant authorities on implementation of the recommendations. Moving on to education. I have previously voiced concern with regards to the Stormont House Agreement, which ignores the role today's children and young people have in the discussion to address the legacy of the conflict. It is, however, in keeping with the predecessor peace agreements, including Good Friday, which pay scant regard to our young people. I therefore welcome the call in the report that the Oral History Archive, as outlined in Stormont House, should be a key resource to teach and support children and young people around understanding the past. And it's important that they understand the world around them and what happened, because that puts into context the experience of their families and their communities. And again, I welcome the recommendations with regards to making wider and earlier use of the whole school curriculum to promote a mutual understanding of Northern Ireland's history and community identities. The authors recognise that this is not a straightforward approach and must start with training and supporting our educators, consulting with parents, and of course with children and young people themselves. The new curriculum cannot replace, but must support the sharing of stories by families and communities. They work in tandem. And it's really important that young people and adults in their communities and adults in their families pass those stories down. But we need the formal education system to put that into some sort of context. However, and it's a fairly big however, none of this is possible without an agreed narrative of the past. What will this new curriculum entail if outside of school, in our places of decision making, in our places of power, and indeed on our streets, we do not have a common, a shared, a composite narrative, call it what you will. And it must be the same curriculum in every school across Northern Ireland. Identity is important. It gives us a sense of belonging and helps us to know who we are and how we fit in, or in some cases don't fit in. The report outlines the complexities of identity for young people, with some believing that these are imposed on them and based on historical issues rather than current context. I have for some time been uncomfortable with the Catholic Nationalist Republican and the Protestant Unionist loyalist attributions that we routinely give our young people purely based on their postcodes. We're ascribing political opinions and political beliefs to a group of very young people who don't have a vote. The two don't go together. However, doing so recognises that our social housing, our education systems, and our communities remain deeply segregated. Division is rife, more so now than for many years in the recent past, and Brexit has provided an opportunity for some to entrench those divisions even more, manipulating their communities. Again, the recommendations have centred around supporting our children, our education system, formal and informal, to embrace their role in supporting children to understand cultural identity on an individual and community level. And key to this is the provision of physical and emotional safety for children and for their educators to be able to do this properly and sustainably. Nikki has previously made a clear recommendation to government that they must support children and young people to play a central role in building a peaceful Northern Ireland, recognising that over many years, children have themselves acted as human rights defenders. This should involve ensuring that children and young people are supported to explore and celebrate their culture and to recognise the right of others to celebrate theirs. There can be no doubt that the most heartbreaking section of this report is the one that addresses the health and well-being of our community. and it builds on the work of CVS and the University of Ulster from 2015. The report clearly makes the connection between conflict, poverty, and poor mental and physical health. It is in these communities, the communities driven by conflict and poverty, that criminal gangs take hold and re-traumatize the individuals within them. The report confirms, and you've heard Katie talk very eloquently about it, what we already know about children's mental health and wellbeing in Northern Ireland. The Young People's Mental Health Prevalence Survey, published a year ago, found that 1 in 8 children and young people here experienced emotional difficulties. Almost 1 in 10 11 to 19-year-olds reported self-injurious behaviours, and 12%, or 1 in 8, reporting thinking about attempting suicide. Children whose parents had current mental health problems were twice as likely to have an anxiety or depressive disorder themselves. The presence of parental mental health problems increased the rate of mood or anxiety disorder in their children by a ratio of 1 to 4. The report, as you've heard, highlights the complexities of transgenerational trauma, demonstrating the length that parents and young people will go to in order to protect each other, but also that it's impossible to address these issues without recognition and support from services. When we see distressed, traumatized, and unwell parents and carers, we have to see and understand the distress and the needs of their children. We also know from the prevalence survey that when 20% most deprived areas were compared to the 20% least deprived areas, there were higher overall rates of emotional and behavioural problems in the most deprived areas. And whilst there are people living with conflict-related trauma in every community in Northern Ireland, what we know is that when it comes to the communities most affected by the conflict as a group, they generally remain those continuing to live with persistent poverty. Comparisons with other jurisdictions isn't always helpful, but it is important to note that in Northern Ireland, where there are 25%, children 25% more likely to experience common mental health problems like depression and anxiety compared to young people in England, Scotland, or Wales. And after reading this report, there can be no doubt why that would be. There has been a marked report, and Katie, I really want, and any young person, really want to say that it's going to get better, and it is getting better. There's been a really marked improvement in our attitude as a society to our children's mental health and well-being. And I do believe there is a real impetus to improve the situation, but we need you to keep on our backs to make that change happen. As I read the report, and I'm coming to an end, you'll be pleased to know. As I read the report, I reflected on the language that we use: legacy of the conflict, victims and survivors. We need to find a language to ensure that we're not comparing today's children with yesterday's children and adults. And whilst connected, they are different. And often the solutions, again, whilst connected, will be different for them. So to conclude, and I'm properly concluded, it's a whole page, but I'm concluding. I caution against any of you who are reading this and thinking, let's prioritize which recommendations we like and which we can put away. And I do caution very strongly against picking and choosing recommendations of this report for implementation, as they are interconnected. Of course, there'll be some sequencing, but a lot of these can be mainstream and docked into broader processes. Addressing the impact of the legacy of the conflict on our children is the job and the role of everyone, and responsibility relies across all agencies and across the whole of the Northern Ireland Executive. So when thinking about implementation, we have to be mindful of the other processes. And I'm going to list some of those because I think it's important that all of us think, yeah, I can see where it would go here and I can see where it would go there. We're still working on the implementation of the Children's Services Cooperation Act, which has a statutory duty on every agency, every children's agency, to cooperate with each other. We have a programme for government and, of course, a children's and young people strategy, which looks at how to mitigate some of the worst disadvantages so many of our children are facing. We have an anti-poverty strategy, which is currently being written and is pending, and again has huge relevance. We have a published mental health strategy, a formidable mental health champion, and an emotional well-being in education framework. And of course, the implementation of Nikki's own still waiting report, which will see improvements in mental health. And again, so many of the recommendations are relevant. We have a family and parenting support strategy. We have safeguarding processes, including the role of safeguarding board for Northern Ireland. We have the work of the Curriculum Authority and the Department of Education and the Education Authority and all the other myriad education bodies we have in Northern Ireland. But we also have an independent review of education, which has now commenced, and this work will be critical, and we will be highlighting this report to them when we meet with them in a couple of weeks. And of course, we have the Tackling Paramilitary Task Force and the Ending the Harm work. Sounds complicated, but this is complicated. But every single one of those and other strategies have a role to play in the implementation of the recommendations of this report. And it's up to all of us to make sure it will happen. And I know, and I am committing my office to work with CVS, but also to work in all our other engagements to make sure that the recommendations in the report is taken on board. So I'm going to end as the report does and talk about young people. Climate justice and mental health campaigns led by young people have demonstrated that they want to have a say. And as Katie says, they're more than capable of having a say in their present and in their future. This and other reports demonstrate that they want to be part of the discussions about how services are designed and delivered, how their communities are protected, and how the future of Northern Ireland and these islands is decided. They have something to say, and we will be reneging on our responsibility to them if we do not listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Kula for engaging in such detail with the findings of this research, and really for reiterating that children and young people want to be involved in discussions about the past and the future and on issues that impact their lives and their communities, the future of Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland. We'd also like to conclude by thanking Andrew for his input earlier, and particularly to Katie and Jessica for their inputs. It's never easy to talk in public, even when we can't physically see our audience. Thanks also to Evie Hurd, who supported us the whole way through organising this event. You can't see her, but she's done a fantastic job in the background. Just a final reminder that the reports are now accessible, and the links I think are on the slide, or Evie has put them in the chat function. The contact details also of the research team are available, and those of the Commission for Victims and Survivors if anybody requires more information or signposting. And we do hope that some of you will be able to join us for the launch of the Young People's Report in Derry, Londonderry in person next month. So thank you again for attending today and for your interest in the research.
No problem, thank you. Yes. So we'll get that chat and stuff to you then.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much. If there's anything you need,
No worries, thank you. Still 8 people on. Going to end it right now. End meeting for all.
You.